He arrived at the concrete gates of Stirling Lines in Hereford with the unmistakable aura of a man who had already conquered the limits of human biology. His name was Master Chief Marcus Vance, a 12-year veteran of the United States Navy SEALs, a survivor of the frozen hell of Kodiak, and a graduate of the most storied special operations training programs the Pentagon could fund. To his peers at Dam Neck, he was a machine. He had survived Hell Week not once but twice, first as a candidate, then as an instructor. He possessed the lung capacity of an Olympic swimmer and the sheer explosive power of a collegiate linebacker. In his mind, excellence was a measurable metric: reps, miles, seconds, and weight. Vance was part of the long-standing Tier 1 exchange program, a quiet arrangement where the best of America met the best of Britain to share tradecraft. He had read the briefings on the Special Air Service. He knew about the Iranian embassy siege in 1980. He knew about the 1.5-mile sniper shots. But as he looked at the SAS operators walking across the compound, men who were lean, medium height, and dressed in mismatched, faded DPM camouflage, he felt a surge of American confidence. These men didn't look like athletes. They didn't look like the super soldiers featured on recruitment posters in San Diego. They looked like residue, the leftovers of a long, exhausting history. "You know the difference between us and them," Vance remarked to his American liaison officer. "We train for the spectacular. These guys look like they train for the boredom." He was half right, but he was about to find out that boredom, in the SAS lexicon, is a psychological weapon more lethal than 1,000 rounds of suppression fire. To understand the tragedy of Master Chief Vance, you have to understand the fundamental category error of the American Special Operations doctrine of the late 20th and early 21st century.
The US system is designed to produce the high-performance athlete. From the first day of BUD/S, Basic Underwater Demolition/SEAL training in Coronado, the stress is loud. It is environmental and communal. You are cold, you are wet, and you are being screamed at by instructors who want to see your physical walls crumble. But in that system, there is a narcotic of feedback. Even when you are failing, the instructors are telling you you're failing. When you are winning, the bell is there for you to ring if you want to quit. The feedback loop is constant. The loop is the lifeblood. The SAS selection operates on a heresy. It is the selection of the void. Wait, before we follow Vance into the mist of the Brecon Beacons, I have a question for the real thinkers in this community. If you had to choose a teammate for a mission behind enemy lines, do you want the guy who can bench press 400 pounds or the guy who can walk for 3 days in the rain without saying a single word? Drop a comment below, athlete or ghost. We're reading every response to see where this community stands on the future of warfare. The first 24 hours of the Hills phase in the Brecon Beacons did not begin with a hoo-ah speech. There was no morning PT at 4 a.m. There were no instructors flipping tires or shouting about the only easy day was yesterday. Instead, Vance and 150 other candidates, most of them drawn from the elite parachute regiment and the Royal Marines, were loaded onto anonymous green trucks in the dark. The destination was a desolate stretch of the South Wales Mountains. The landscape was a geography of disorientation. Rolling, featureless peaks covered in a saturated, toxic green moss, hidden bogs that could swallow a man to his waist, and a ground fog so dense it felt like walking inside a bowl of milk. The instructions given to Vance were 5 words. Reach this coordinate. Now go. Vance checked his map. He was carrying a Bergen rucksack weighing 55 pounds, not including his rifle or his water. He looked at his Garmin GPS, a piece of high-tier technology he had brought from the States.
One of the SAS instructors, a grey man with eyes that looked like they had been scrubbed with sandpaper, stepped forward. He didn't scream. He didn't even raise his voice. "No electronics, Master Chief," the instructor said, his voice a low, clinical rasp. "In the regiment, a battery is a permission to fail. We navigate with the eyes and the mind. Leave it on the truck." Vance surrendered the GPS, feeling a momentary, informational chill. He was now alone with a paper map and a magnetic compass, but his confidence was still intact. "I've navigated the Alaskan wilderness," he thought. "I can handle a few hills and wheels." What Vance didn't understand was that he wasn't being tested for his navigation. He was being tested for his relationship with the signal. In the American military, performance is a response to external stimuli. If a SEAL is running a 10-mile timed run, he knows the standard. He knows where the finish line is. He knows his split times. His brain allocates its metabolic resources based on the known endpoint. But as Vance stepped into the first valley, he realized there was no endpoint. If you're finding this technical breakdown of the Tier 1 mindset fascinating, you're in the right place. We are uncovering the lore that the mainstream media ignores. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. It's the only way to join the thinking soldier inner circle and ensure you don't miss the 17th second of our next breakdown. He reached the first checkpoint in record time. He arrived at the table where an SAS directing staff, DS, member sat with a clipboard. Vance was breathing hard, but he was winning. He wanted the signal. He wanted the loop to close. "What's my time, Sergeant Major?" Vance asked, his hands on his knees.
"Am I ahead of the pack?" The DS didn't look up. He marked a box on the clipboard with a pencil. The sound of the lead on the paper was the only response. "Keep moving," the DS said. "Yeah, but did I hit the standard?" Vance pressed. "I need to know the split so I can adjust my pace." The DS finally looked at him. It wasn't a look of pride or encouragement. It was a look of biological indifference. It was the look a scientist gives a lab rat that has just completed a turn in a maze. "The standard is the hill, Vance. The hill is still there. Move." This was the first kinetic strike against Vance's soul. The void had begun. By the 12-hour mark, the athlete began to struggle. It wasn't the weight. Vance was strong. It was the cognitive starvation. In the US Navy, Vance was a social creature. He drew strength from the team, from the brotherhood, from the loud communal suffering of BUD/S. But in the Brecon Beacons, the SAS removes the buddy. You are forbidden from talking to other candidates. You are forbidden from walking in groups. You are a ghost in a world of ghosts. Vance found himself walking through a whiteout on a ridgeline called Penny Fan. The wind was a horizontal slap of freezing sleet. His map was a soggy mess. His boots were slurrying. The skin of his soles was starting to detach from the flesh due to the constant immersion in the bogs. In any other selection, this would be the moment for the motivation. The instructor would be there to tell him to dig deep, but there was no one. Vance reached the third checkpoint at 11 p.m. He was shivering, his body entering the first stages of metabolic debt. He looked at the DS. He was desperate for a well done. He was desperate for any indication that his suffering was accounted for. The DS looked at his watch, marked the clipboard, said nothing. Vance stood there for 30 seconds, his brain spinning in the vacuum. The lack of feedback was creating a neurological friction. Without the signal from the machine, Vance's internal engine was starting to stall. He wasn't thinking about the next grid reference, he was thinking about the injustice of the silence.
Think about the pressure of that moment. 1 centimeter of mental error, and you become the very thing you are fighting. A quitter. If you believe Vance has what it takes to finish, smash that like button. Let's see if we can get 5,000 likes for the residue of courage before we move to the next part. This is unprofessional, Vance muttered to himself as he walked back into the dark. How can you run a selection without data? How do I know if I'm elite if no one is watching? He didn't realize that the SAS was watching. They were just watching the residue. They were looking for the man who doesn't need to be told he's elite. They were looking for the man who is the standard, even when the clipboard is empty. Vance was the best athlete on the hill, but he was a validation-dependent species. And in the abyss of Wales, that was a terminal diagnosis. The first 48 hours were only the aperture. The long drag, the 40-mile final march, was still to come. And Vance, the man who had survived the loudest training on Earth, was about to be broken by the quietest. The question wasn't whether his muscles would hold. The question was whether his mind could survive the 48-hour abyss of total informational silence. By the dawn of day 3, the Brecon Beacons had transitioned from a physical challenge into a biological solvent. In the Hereford lexicon, this is known as the transition of the bone. The initial 48 hours of any selection course are fueled by the narcotic of the start, a cocktail of adrenaline, stored glycogen, and the residual arrogance of a decorated past. But as the sun failed to rise over the clag, the thick, iron-grey fog that permanently haunts the South Wales peaks, Master Chief Marcus Vance realized that his 12 years as a Navy SEAL had provided him with a false map of human endurance. In the American Tier 1 communities, stress is often a sprint. Whether it is a direct action raid in the Somali compound or the high-octane intensity of Hell Week, the objective is visible and the timeline is compressed. You are cold, yes, but you are cold with your class. You are tired, but you are tired in a way that can be screamed out. The SAS Hills phase, however, is a marathon of the void. It is designed to induce a state of mechanical attrition, where the environment doesn't attack you, it simply abstains from supporting you. Vance stood at the base of a peak known informally as the Big Stomp. His 55-pound Bergen felt like it was fused to his lumbar spine, the nylon straps cutting through his sweat-soaked smock into the raw, metabolic bruising of his shoulders. He looked at his map, which was now a translucent, fragile ghost of its former self, stained by the acidic Welsh rain. In San Diego, he was a god. Here he was just Candidate 42, a biological variable being tested for the residue. Wait, before we look into the chemistry of the quit, I have a question for you. Have you ever been in the situation where you did everything right, but received absolutely zero recognition? How did it feel? Tell us in the comments. Starved or self-sufficient? We're looking for the 1% who understands the psychological price of the shadow. If you're finding this analysis of the species of special forces more informative than 1,000 tactical manuals, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm that quality still matters. The Big Stomp is a 40-degree incline of tussocks, thick uneven clumps of grass that hide ankle-breaking holes and waist-deep bogs of stagnant black peat.
In the American system, a climb like this would be a communal event. You would hear the cadence of your brothers. You would see the trident on the man in front of you. But the SAS removes the audience. Vance was alone. He reached the summit at 10:15 a.m. The wind was gusting at 50 miles per hour, stripping the microclimate of heat from his body. He approached the cadre table, his hands shaking as he pulled the map from his waterproof case. The DS, a corporal from the Special Reconnaissance Regiment, SRR, didn't look at Vance's face. He was looking at a stopwatch that Vance wasn't allowed to see. "Am I on the line?" Vance asked, his voice cracking from the acoustic silence of the last 10 hours. The DS marked a coordinate on a sheet of paper. He didn't offer a chair. He didn't offer a, "Well done, Master Chief." "Keep moving," the DS said. "I've got a hot spot on my left heel," Vance stated, a standard American safety report designed to initiate a feedback loop of care. The DS finally looked up. His eyes were like two pieces of unpolished flint, reflecting a century of imperial wars. "The next grid is 6 miles east-northeast. If you can't walk on your heel, the truck is at the bottom of the valley. Get on it and go back to San Diego. No one is forcing you to be here, Marcus." This was the Hereford binary. In the American system, an elite soldier is a valuable asset. The machine invests millions in his training and therefore wants him to succeed. The instructors will scream him into success. But the SAS views a candidate as residue. They are not trying to build an operator, they are trying to extract the one that is already there. If you need a safety report or a pat on the back, you are the wrong species. Vance turned and walked into the mist. But something in his OODA loop had short-circuited. If you're finding this deep dive into the neurobiology of the elite fascinating, you're in the right place. We are uncovering the lore that the mainstream media ignores. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. It's the only way to join the thinking soldier inner circle and ensure you don't miss the 17th second of our next breakdown. To understand the breakdown of a SEAL on the SAS course, you have to understand the psychology of the feedback loop. The US Navy breeds champions. A SEAL is taught that he is the best in the world. He is given the best gear, Cry precision uniforms, Ops Corps helmets, and multi-million-dollar support networks. This creates a narcissism of the elite. But the SAS is the unit of the grey man. Their gear is often archaic by American standards. Their smocks are made of ventile or heavy canvas that absorbs water until it weighs 10 pounds. Their rucksacks are simple metal frames. They abstain from the spectacle. By the afternoon of day 4, Vance's brain was starving. The human brain is an information-seeking organ. When it is deprived of feedback, no "hoo-ah", no "good split times", no "go team", it begins to generate its own noise. Vance started to talk to himself. He began to argue with the ghost of his BUD/S instructors. Why am I doing this? I'm already a Master Chief. I've run ops in the southern Philippines. I've done direct action in the Levant. Why am I walking in the rain for people who don't even respect the rank? This is the abyss of the mind. The SAS selection doesn't just test your muscles, it tests your internal north. In Hereford, they have a phrase, the loneliness of the long-distance soldier. They are looking for the man who doesn't need the machine to tell him he's winning. They are looking for the individualist who can operate for 3 weeks behind enemy lines with a broken radio and no support, and still complete the mission because his standard is internal. Vance reached the 6th checkpoint at 4 p.m. He was metabolically empty. His body had begun to cannibalize its own muscle tissue, a process known as gluconeogenesis, to provide fuel for his brain. He looked at the DS and saw a British paratrooper, a man who had failed his first selection and was now back for a second attempt. The paratrooper was smaller than Vance, less muscular, and his gear looked like it belonged in a museum. But the paratrooper was smiling. "Lovely weather for a stroll, isn't it, Yank?" the paratrooper whispered as he passed the table. Vance watched him go. The paratrooper didn't ask for his time. He didn't ask for a split. He just inhabited the misery. The paratrooper possessed the austerity of the spirit. He knew that the standard was the only thing that mattered. and the standard didn't have a voice. Think about the metabolic price of that smile. In the face of total exhaustion, a smile is a tactical declaration of dominance. If you think you could smile in a Welsh bog after 72 hours, smash that like button. Let's see how many ghosts we have in the audience. Vance's athlete identity was dying. He was no longer the machine from Dam Neck. He was just a cold, wet man with slurrying feet and a map that was falling apart in his hands. He was experiencing the geography of failure, the realization that your past glory is a dead weight in the present moment. The American system had built him to be a performance artist. He was trained to succeed when people were watching. He was trained to be elite when the medals were being issued. But in the abyss of the hills, there were no medals. There was no audience. There was only the residue of a man who didn't even know if he was still in the race. This is the heresy that the SAS has practiced since Malaya in 1950. They realized that in the jungle, or the urban abyss, the organization man is a liability. Only the ghost survives.
As the sun set behind the jagged silhouette of the Black Mountains on day 4, Vance sat in a bog, his head in his hands. He was at the threshold of the unknown. The machine in Virginia was still tracking his progress via a liaison radio. They were expecting a spectacular performance. They wanted a story for the evening news. But in the void of Wales, there are no spectators. There is only the standard. Vance looked at his compass. The needle was dancing in the magnetic static of the iron-rich rock. He had a choice. He could wait for the truck, or he could find his internal north. He stood up, not because he wanted to win, but because he realized that quitting requires an audience too. And on this hill, there was no one to even watch him fail. The long drag was approaching. 40 miles. No finish line. No clock. The ultimate extraction of the residue. Will the seal find his soul in the Welsh mud? Or will the athlete finally ring the bell that doesn't exist? Find out in Part 3. You've made it to the end of Part 2. You're part of the residue of our audience. Most people have the attention span of a gnat, but you have the cognitive control of an operator. Hit the like button one last time and subscribe. The next part is where the politics of the shadow meet the reality of the hero. Leave a comment if you think the American system is superior to the British. The clock at Hereford is ticking, and the 17th second of the long drag is just beginning. By the dawn of the final phase of the hills, the 150 candidates who had stood in the sun at Stirling Lines had been reduced to a residue of 42. Among them, Master Chief Marcus Vance remained, not because his body was thriving, but because his 12 years of SEAL discipline had turned his will into a self-flagellating engine. But Vance was no longer the athlete of Part 1. He was a spectre of attrition. His weight had dropped by 11 pounds in 5 days. His face, once a picture of Californian vitality, was now a mask of grey, rain-scoured skin and Appalachian eyes. The sunken, 1,000-yard stare of a man who has looked into the vacuum and seen nothing looking back. In the Hereford world, this state is known as the metabolic zero. It is the point where the body has exhausted its glycogen stores, burned through its adipose tissue, and begun the autophagy of its own muscle fiber. To a conventional military doctor, Vance was a medical emergency. To the SAS directing staff, he was finally ready to begin the test. Wait, before we follow Vance into the 64-kilometer long drag, I have a question for the real thinkers in this community. In a situation of total survival, which is more dangerous? The cold that kills the body, or the silence that kills the hope? Drop your answer in the comments. Cold or silence? We're looking for the 1% of viewers who understand that the mind is the only true weapon. The final test is known as endurance, though the men on the hill call it the long drag. It is a 64-kilometer, 40-mile, solo navigation march across the highest ridgelines of the Brecon Beacons, carrying a 55-pound burden, not including water, food, or the weight of an unslung rifle. In the American system, a ruck is a linear event. You start at point A, you walk to point B, and you have a pace setter or a clock to measure your progress. The SAS removed the clock. At 2 a.m., in a lightless, wind-whipped barn at the base of the mountains, the 42 remaining men were assembled. There was no hooah briefing. There was no go-get-em speech from a general. There was only the austerity of the brief. An SAS major, a veteran of the secret war in Oman, stood by a flickering lantern and read out a single grid reference. "This is your start point," the major said. "Reach the first grid. If you arrive, you will be given the second. If you don't, you'll see the truck. Do not talk. Do not follow the man in front. If you are caught tailgating, you are binned immediately. No one is coming to save you." Vance stepped out into the whiteout. The temperature was 33 degrees Fahrenheit, the exact temperature where the human body loses heat 25 times faster than in dry air because of the moisture. The Welsh sleet was a horizontal wall of ice. Vance looked at the black silhouette of the mountain and felt a systemic chill. In the Navy SEALs, he was used to the frozen abyss of the ocean, but in the water you are a machine of movement. On the long drag, you are a machine of weight. To understand the physics of the long drag, you must understand the kinetic impact on the skeletal system. Every step with a 55-pound burden on a 30-degree incline generates a force of nearly 600 pounds on the lumbar spine and the knee joints. Over 64 kilometers, this force is applied roughly 80,000 times. If you're finding this technical deconstruction of human limits fascinating, hit the like button right now. It tells the algorithm that there is still an audience for quality content that doesn't rely on flashy explosions. Help us hit our goal of 10,000 likes for the residue of the thinking soldier. Vance's feet were already in a state of slurry. This is the SAS term for immersion foot, where the skin, constantly soaked in the acidic water of the peat bogs, begins to detach from the connective tissue. Every step was no longer a movement. It was a lethal stimulus. But the physical pain was a secondary variable. The primary variable was the informational vacuum. Vance reached the first checkpoint after 4 hours of slicing the dark. He arrived at the table, his breath a plume of white steam. He looked at the DS and waited for the closing of the loop. He needed the DS to tell him he was winning. He needed the machine to validate his status as a Tier 1 operator.
"Next grid," Vance rasped, his voice sounding like a ghost in the wind.
The DS marked the paper. "Grid 42 Echo, 6 miles, move."
"Wait,"
Vance said, his feedback dependency reaching a crisis point.
"How am I doing on time? Am I in the top decile? Give me a split time, Sergeant Major."
The DS didn't even look up from his thermos of tea. "The only split time that matters, Vance, is the one between your boots and the mud. If you're still standing, you haven't failed yet. If you need a score, you've already lost the vibe. Move." Vance turned back into the sleet,
and for the first time in 12 years, the athlete died. He realized that the American machine had built him to be a performance artist. He was trained to succeed when people were watching. He was trained to be elite when the medals were being issued. But in the abyss of the long drag, there were no medals. There was no audience. There was only the residue of a man who didn't even know if he was still in the race. This is the heresy that Charlie Beckwith, the founder of Delta Force, identified when he trained with the SAS in 1962. He realized that the US system produces athletes of the hierarchy, while the British system produces ghosts of the void. As Vance climbed the peak of Fan-y-Big for the third time that night, he began to hallucinate. He saw the bell from the BUD/S compound in Coronado, the brass bell that SEAL candidates ring 3 times to quit. He wanted that bell. He wanted the spectacle of quitting. He wanted the closure of failure. But in the SAS selection, there is no bell. There is only a silent withdrawal. You just stop walking, and the mountains consume you until the truck finds your residue at dawn. Think about the psychological stamina required to walk into nothingness. Most people quit when the path gets dark, but the thinking soldier ignores the path and follows the compass. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell.
Join the 1% who finishes the journey. We are declassifying the secrets of the most autonomous units on Earth. Vance looked at his compass. The needle was dancing in the magnetic static of the iron-rich rock. He was dead reckoning, counting his paces, feeling the slope of the earth through his slurrying feet. He was navigating with his cerebellum, the part of the brain that handles subconscious motor patterns. His prefrontal cortex, the seat of his ego and his rank, had effectively browned out due to the metabolic zero. He was becoming a thinking soldier. He passed a British paratrooper, the same one who had smiled in part 2. The paratrooper was sitting in a bog, his Bergen resting against a rock. He wasn't quitting. He was abstaining from the pain. He was eating a cold tin of sardines, his eyes fixed on the internal north. "Keep your head down, Yank," the paratrooper whispered. "The hill doesn't care who you are. It only cares that you're still heavy." Vance didn't respond. He couldn't. He was metabolically redlined. But as he pushed past the paratrooper, he felt a neural resonance. He realized that the paratrooper wasn't stronger than him. The paratrooper was just less dependent. He didn't need the hoo-ah. He didn't need the machine. He was just a species that had evolved to live in the rain. The long drag is the final filtration. It is the moment where the SAS extracts the individual from the organization. By the 18-hour mark, Vance had covered 52 kilometers. He was entering the terminal abyss. His heart rate, measured by a biometric monitor he was secretly wearing for the exchange study, was a steady, rhythmic 145 beats per minute, a biological metronome. He was no longer Marcus Vance, the SEAL. He was just a variable being resolved by the geometry of the hill. He reached the final ridgeline of Penny Fan. The clag had lifted for a microsecond, revealing a world of jagged grey rock and vertical drops. He looked down at the valley floor and saw a single pair of headlights, the extraction truck. In any other military on Earth, that would be the victory. The candidate would run, he would shout, he would close the loop. But Vance didn't run. He didn't even smile. He adjusted the straps of his Bergen, checked his bearing one last time, and glided down the slope with the austerity of movement he had learned from the grey men. He reached the table at 22:15. He had been walking for 20 hours and 15 minutes. The DS looked at his watch. He marked a box on the clipboard. "Bergen on the scale," the DS said. Vance swung the pack onto the scale. It read 55.4 pounds.
The standard had been met by a margin of 0.4. Vance stood there, waiting for the dopamine hit. He waited for the "Welcome to the regiment." He waited for the DS to acknowledge that a Navy SEAL had just completed the most difficult march in the British military. The DS looked at the scale, then at Vance's Appalachian eyes. "Truck's there, Vance. Get some sleep. You've got the board in 4 hours." Vance walked to the truck in silence. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't even feel elite. He felt like residue. And that was the moment he finally badged into the truth of the SAS. The athlete was gone. The ghost was born. But the machine at the Pentagon was not finished with him. And the board, the final psychological deconstruction, was waiting to see if the species was stable. What happens when the thinking soldier has to face the grey men in a windowless room? What is the final standard that no SEAL has ever been trained for? Find out in Part 4. You've made it to the 60,000 character mark with us. You are the residue of our audience. You have the cognitive stamina to see the mission through. Drop a comment if you think Miller was wrong to ask for his time. Let's trigger the debate. Hit the like button and subscribe. The 17th second of the board is coming.
4 a.m. Stirling Lines, Hereford. In the world of the big army, this is the hour of the stand-to, the ritualistic preparation for the dawn attack. But for Master Chief Marcus Vance, sitting on a hard wooden bench in a hallway that smelled of floor wax, stale tobacco, and the ozone of a dying fluorescent light, this was the psychological bends. He had been awake for nearly 40 hours. He had just covered 64 kilometers of vertical Welsh mud with a 55-pound load. His body was a landscape of inflammation. His feet were throbbing in a rhythmic, agonizing pulse that matched the ticking of the clock on the wall. In the American Tier 1 system, the completion of a suicide march, like the long drag, is followed by a ritual of recognition. There is usually a medical check, a high-calorie meal, and a well done from the commanding officer. But in Hereford, there is no well done. There is only the board. The board is the final filtration of the Special Air Service. It is the moment where the grey men, the senior NCOs and officers who manage the regiment's secret history, look past the muscles and the medals to find the liar in the soul. They are searching for the residue of the ego. Wait, before we step into that windowless room with Vance, I have a question for the real thinkers in this community. If you had just walked 40 miles through hell and someone told you that you were a failure and a cheat just to see how you'd react, what would you do? Would you scream, or would you stay silent? Drop a single word in the comments, scream or silence. And if you followed Vance's journey through 60,000 characters, you are the residue of this audience. Hit the like button and subscribe. We are uncovering the lore that the Pentagon doesn't want in the textbooks. Vance was summoned into the room by a voice that possessed no inflection. It was a biological flatline. The room was small, lit by a single bulb that hummed at a frequency that irritated Vance's metabolically exhausted brain. Behind a tattered folding table sat 3 men. To an outsider, they looked like middle-aged civilians, men you might see in a hardware store. They wore sweaters with holes in the elbows and corduroy trousers, but their eyes were vessels of the abyss. They were veteran operators who had survived the jungles of Borneo and the sector clearing of the First Gulf War. Vance stood to attention, the reflexive muscle memory of the Navy SEAL taking over. He expected a tactical debrief. He expected to talk about his navigation splits and his pace counting. "Sit down, Vance," the Center Inquisitor said. He didn't use Vance's rank. In Hereford, rank is residue. Vance sat. His body wanted to collapse, but his athlete's ego held him upright. "Tell us, Marcus," the Inquisitor began. "Why are you here? Why does a Master Chief with a silver star and a trident need to walk in the rain in Wales? Is your ego not satisfied in San Diego?" Vance blinked. The question was a category error. "I'm here to represent the US Navy, sir. To share tradecraft and prove that our Tier 1 standards are compatible with the regiment." The Inquisitor leaned forward, his face illuminated by the flickering bulb. "Wrong. You're here because you're a validation junkie. You're here because you need another badge to tell the world you're a god. But on the long drag, there was no world. There were no cameras. There was just you and the mud. And we saw what you did at Checkpoint 4. Vance felt a surge of status panic. "I hit every grid, sir. My navigation was surgical." The Inquisitor threw a tattered map onto the table. It wasn't Vance's map. It was a fabrication, a map with a red line drawn through a denied sector. "I have a question for the tacticians watching. In a high-stakes interrogation, is a lie more dangerous than the truth? Or is the reaction to the lie the real threat? Comment below. Truth or reaction? If you're finding this breakdown of SAS psychological warfare fascinating, hit the like button. It helps us keep the Thinking Soldier series out of the algorithm's shadow. A candidate reported that you took a shortcut through the Elan Valley. The Inquisitor continued. You bypassed the 30-degree incline to save 20 minutes. You're a cheat, Vance. You're a champion who couldn't handle the austerity of the hill. Get out. The truck is waiting. This was the injustice test. In the American military, the standard is protected by a legal hierarchy. If you are accused of cheating, you demand an inquiry. You cite your decorated record. You use your silver star as a shield. The US system breeds defenders of the self. Vance's face turned a deep, cortisol-driven red. His 12 years of SEAL pride erupted like a kinetic charge. "That's a lie!" Vance shouted, his voice cracking the acoustic silence of the room. "I want to know who said that. I've survived Hell Week. I don't need shortcuts. I am a Master Chief in the United States Navy. My integrity is above your British mind games." He stood up, his hands balled into fists, his species of the athlete fully manifest. He was demanding the loop. He needed the external authority to correct the record and validate his status. The three Inquisitors didn't move. They didn't blink. They watched Vance's outburst with the same biological indifference the DS had shown on the hill. "Sit down, Marcus," the center man said quietly. "You're still looking for a father to tell you you're a good boy. You're still powered by the audience. The moment the audience accused you of a lie, your will shattered. You didn't argue the standard. You argued your status." Vance sat down, the adrenaline crash hitting him like a physical blow. He realized he had just failed the most important 17 seconds of the entire selection. In Hereford, they don't care if you're a cheat. They care if you care what they think. The thinking soldier is a man who can hold the residue of injustice in his mind and keep moving. If an SAS patrol is falsely accused of a war crime in a foreign land, they don't scream at the local population. They vaporize into the shadows and complete the mission. You finish the march because the march exists, not because we're watching, the Inquisitor continued. But you were walking for the trident. You were walking for the evening news. You are a spectacle soldier. You are not the species we are looking for." The room went into a deep vacuum. Vance looked at the map, then at the grey men. He saw the quality gap that the Hereford legends had warned him about. He saw that his trident was just a piece of gold-plated metal, and in the abyss, metal has no value. Only the residue matters. If you're still with us at this level of detail, you belong in our Tier 1 viewer group. Most people skip the psychological deconstruction, but you know that the mind is where the war is won. Hit that subscribe button to join the only community on YouTube that analyzes the neurobiology of the elite. Don't miss the final Part 5. While Vance was being dismantled, the British paratrooper, the one who had smiled in Part 2, was being interviewed in the next room. The Inquisitors gave him the same false accusation. They told him he was a coward who had hidden in a barn to avoid the storm. The paratrooper was quiet for 10 seconds. He didn't look at the DS. He looked at the internal north he had found on day 4. "I didn't hide in a barn," the paratrooper said, his voice a low, unhurried rasp. "If you think I did, then bin me. The hill knows I was there. That's enough for me." He didn't demand a correction. He didn't insist on his status. He held the injustice with a metabolic silence. He had decoupled his ego from the machine. The Inquisitors nodded. "That's a thinking ghost," one of them whispered. "He argued with the void. He stays." Vance was rotated back to the American liaison barracks 6 hours later. He wasn't diminished in the eyes of the US Navy. He had still finished the hardest course in the world, but in his own mind, he was a category error. He sat in the extraction truck, looking at the clock tower as it receded into the Welsh mist. He remembered the paratrooper's smile. He realized that the paratrooper hadn't won a race. He had surrendered to a standard. Vance picked up his 12-year-old SEAL logbook. He looked at the entries: combat tours, medals, high-altitude jumps. It all looked like a script for a movie he no longer wanted to star in. "We aren't equal," Vance whispered to the empty truck. "We're just different." Part 4 of the SAS versus SEAL saga is the story of the murder of the ego. It is the story of how the machine of the American elite is built on external validation, and how the ghost of Hereford is built on internal austerity. But the story doesn't end with a failure, because 3 months later, Master Chief Marcus Vance did something that no SEAL in the history of the exchange program had ever done. He didn't go back to San Diego to tell stories about the crazy Brits. He returned to Hereford, without his trident, without his rank. He requested to start the Hills phase from day 1, not as an exchange officer, but as a Candidate 0. He was ready to stop being an athlete and start being a residue. Will Vance survive his second descent into the abyss? Or will the geography of failure claim him forever? If you've reached the 80,000 character mark, you are part of the elite 1% of this channel. You understand that the thinking soldier is a state of mind, not a uniform. Show your commitment to the standard. Hit the like button, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, if you were Vance, would you have gone back for a second time? Or would you have taken your silver star and gone home? The rain in Herefordshire does not merely fall, it inhabits. It is a permanent grey presence that smells of wet slate, diesel exhaust, and the ancient oxygen-starved mud of the Welsh borders. In January 1979, 4 months after the snapshot of Anomaly, that saw Master Chief Marcus Vance driven away in the extraction truck of the Bind, a man stood at the gates of Sterling Lines. He was wearing an unremarkable civilian raincoat. He carried a battered duffel bag. He had no rank on his shoulders. He had no trident on his chest. He was no longer a Master Chief. He was not even Vance. In the eyes of the SAS directing staff, he was simply Candidate 42, a biological variable returning to the vacuum. Vance had spent 90 days in a state of cognitive purgatory. He had returned to San Diego to a hero's welcome that felt like a funeral. His SEAL teammates at Dam Neck had praised his toughness for finishing the long drag, but Vance could still feel the residue of the Inquisitor's voice in his head. "You are a spectacle, soldier. You are not the species we are looking for." He realized that as long as he carried the trident, he was a prisoner of the machine. To become the ghost, he had to murder the athlete. He had resigned his commission, surrendered his pension, and flown back to England on his own dime to face the geography of failure one last time. Wait, before we witness the resurrection of the ghost, I have a final question for the 1% who have completed this 100,000 character journey. Is it possible for a human being to truly delete their ego? Or is the thinking soldier just a man who has learned to hide his pride better than the rest? Drop a comment below. Delete or hide? If you stayed with us through the long drag of this series, you are the residue of our community. Hit the like button and subscribe. We are the only channel on the platform dedicated to the neurobiology of the Tier 1 elite. The second descent, the austerity of presence. The second Hills phase was qualitatively different for Candidate 42. He was no longer closing the loop. He was no longer checking his split times or searching for a validation signal in the eyes of the cadre. He had entered a state of metabolic stasis. To understand the biological shift in Miller, you have to look at the chemistry of the second attempt. On his first selection, Vance's body was a furnace of cortisol. He was burning through his glycogen stores at an unsustainable rate because his mind was in a state of validational panic. He was walking to prove he was a SEAL. On his second attempt, he was walking to be the Hill. He moved through the brine slurry with a reflexive fluidity. He didn't look for the DS at the checkpoints. He didn't ask for his time. He didn't even look at the clipboard. When he reached the table, he simply handed over his map, waited for the mark, and vaporized back into the mist. He had abstained from the audience. The SAS major, the same grey man who had dismantled him in the board 4 months earlier, watched Candidate 42 through a pair of long-range optics from a ridgeline on Penny Fan. "Look at the yank," the major whispered to a subordinate. "He's stopped performing. He's moving with the Hereford vibe. He's not an athlete anymore. He's a thinking ghost." The Hills tried to break him with the same suicidal weather that had killed candidates in 1963. A sudden whiteout dropped the visibility to 2 meters. The temperature plummeted to -5 degrees Celsius. In the American system, this would be a safety stop. But in Hereford, the weather is just another selection variable. Vance didn't stop. He used dead reckoning, counting his paces, feeling the acoustic pressure of the valley walls to sense his position through the wind. He was navigating with his cerebellum, the seat of subconscious motor patterns. His prefrontal cortex, the seat of the ego, was effectively offline. The water abyss, the SBS filtration. But the SAS selection has a secret layer that the American exchange programs rarely reach: the transition to the water abyss. For candidates who show high-fidelity autonomy on the Hills, the regiment sometimes integrates the swimmer-canoeist protocols of the Special Boat Service, SBS. Miller was moved from the mountains of Wales to the freezing, lightless waters of Poole Harbour. In the Navy SEALs, Vance had been a master of the water. He had survived the Pacific surf and the frozen abyss of Alaska. But the American water training is loud. It is about overcoming the ocean through sheer physical aggression.
The British water abyss is about surrender. Miller was placed in a two-man klepper canoe, a fragile frame of wood and canvas, and told to navigate 30 miles of coastal swamp in total darkness. He was submerged to his neck in 4-degree water for hours, with no radio and no support. This is the squad selection. It is designed to induce sensory deprivation. In the American system, if you drift off course in the water, a safety boat flashes a light. In the abyss, there are no lights. If you drift into the shipping lanes or the mud flats, you simply evaporate from the course. Vance spent 12 hours in a state of functional disassociation. His body was shivering so violently, it was creating its own kinetic heat, but his mind was still. He wasn't thinking about the trident he had lost or the senior chief title he had surrendered. He was thinking about the 17th second of the paddle stroke. He was practicing the austerity of the abyss. Think about the difference here. The SEALs train to conquer the water. The SBS trains to become part of the water. If you think the austerity of the British method is more effective for stealth, hit the like button right now. It helps us keep the Thinking Soldier series alive and free from the algorithm's redaction. The board. The final 0 day. 21. The long drag was over. Miller had finished the 64-kilometer march 3 hours ahead of the standard, but he didn't even mention it to the DS. He sat on the bench outside the target cell, his feet slurrying in his boots, his mind a blank slate of purpose. He was summoned to the board for the second time. The room was the same. The flickering fluorescent bulb, the smell of floor wax, the 3 grey men, and Colonel Silas Thorne, the American heretic, watching from the corner with a residue of hope in his eyes. The Inquisitor leaned forward. He didn't use a map this time. He used a psychological scalpel. "Candidate 42, the Inquisitor began. "We've reviewed your file. You resigned your commission in the US Navy to come back here. You gave up a 6-figure salary, a silver star, and a trident to walk in the rain for a unit that doesn't even want you. That's not elite behavior, Marcus. That's mental instability. You're a fanatic, and we don't put fanatics in the regiment. Fanatics die in the first week. Get out. The truck is already loaded." This was the sacrifice test. A champion would have argued. A spectacle soldier would have cited his sacrifice as proof of his loyalty. He would have demanded the loop to be closed. He would have shouted about honor and commitment. Vance sat perfectly still. His Appalachian eyes, the sunken, hollowed-out look of the selection veteran, didn't blink. He didn't feel the status panic of 4 months ago. He looked through the Inquisitor as if he were looking through a clag on the mountain. "I didn't come here for the beret, sir," Vance said. His voice was a low, unhurried rasp, the austerity of the truth. "I came here for the standard. The hill doesn't care if I'm in the regiment. The water doesn't care if I'm a SEAL. I found the standard on day 4 of the first march, and I realized I hadn't hit it in 12 years. I'm not here to be badged. I'm here to be finished. If you think I'm a fanatic, bin me. I'll be back on the hills tomorrow morning on my own time. The march continues whether you mark the clipboard or not." The silence that followed was the 17th second of the American-British alliance. The Inquisitors didn't move. They exchanged a glance that carried the weight of 30 years of shadow warfare. Then, the SAS major did something he had never done to an American exchange officer. He stood up. He walked around the table. He didn't offer a hooah.
He didn't offer a medal or a certificate of achievement. He handed Miller a faded, sand-colored beret with a winged dagger patch. "You're not an athlete anymore, Marcus," the Major said. "You're a thinking soldier. Welcome to the species." The final verdict: the birth of the Tier 1 species. Vance's return to the United States was the biological trigger for a revolution. He didn't go back to the SEALs. He was recruited by Silas Thorne to become one of the founding instructors of a new unit, 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment, Delta. He brought the Hereford DNA to Fort Bragg.
He abolished the loud motivation. He removed the dopamine feedback. He implemented a selection process where the instructors were grey men and the hills were the only judge. He taught the American elite that the most dangerous weapon is not the machine or the satellite, but the human being who has stopped needing. The geography of failure was transplanted from the Brecon Beacons to the Appalachian Mountains. The silence became the American standard. The success of Delta Force in the decades that followed, the snatch of high-value targets in the urban abyss of Baghdad, the 1.5-mile whisper in the mountains of Tora Bora, was the direct result of Vance's murder of the ego. The American military had finally learned the British heresy. Quantity is not a substitute for quality, but quality is a force multiplier for the soul. Think about the legacy of that moment. One man's failure changed the way a superpower fights its wars. If you believe Marcus Vance is the most important soldier you've never heard of, hit the like button and subscribe. We are the only channel declassifying the genetic history of special forces. The clock tower and the mist. Today, the machine of the Pentagon is more powerful than ever. We have AI-driven drones, satellite-guided targeting cycles, and digital dominance. But in the shadow wars of the 21st century, in the grey zones of the Sahel, the Levant, and the Eastern European plains, the machine is still blind. The drones still lose signal in the dust. The satellites still see thermal mirages in the heat of the city. The organization men still freeze in the vacuum of order. And in that darkness, the thinking soldier is still the only weapon that works. He is the man who doesn't need a silver star to keep walking through a blizzard. He is the woman who doesn't need a thank you to sit in a cellar for 14 days watching a doorway. He is the residue of the human spirit that remains when the technology fails and the battery dies. Marcus Vance is long retired now. He lives in the quiet town in Virginia. He doesn't have a trident on his truck. He doesn't have a veteran hat or a collection of shadow boxes on his wall. He sits on his porch and watches the rain. His neighbors think he's just a quiet, perhaps slightly eccentric old man. They don't know that he is a different species. They don't know that he has seen the 17th second. But the clock tower in Hereford is still ticking. Somewhere in the Brecon Beacons right now, a young Navy SEAL, inspired by the law of Vance, is shivering in a peat bog at 3 a.m. He is cold. He is wet. He is metabolically empty. He looks at the grey man with the clipboard and he wants to scream. He wants to close the loop. He wants the instructor to tell him he's doing a good job. But then he remembers the heresy. He remembers that the silence is the only true test. He picks up his 55-pound Bergen. He checks his compass, and he walks into the void. He is not an athlete. He is not a hero. He is becoming a thinking soldier. Selection never ends. The 17 seconds are always now. And the residue never quits. Who dares wins. You've reached the final coordinate. You are part of the residue of this series, the 1% who finishes what they start. If you found this 100,000 character deep dive into the thinking soldier doctrine to be the highest standard of content on YouTube, hit that like button one last time. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. We have many more redacted histories to uncover. Tell us in the comments, which unit should we deconstruct next? The Spetsnaz, the GINN, or the secrets of the SRR? The decision is yours. The watch continues.